Hi, my name's Starsky and welcome to From the Studio on Clubbing TV. And in this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the weird and wonderful world of mystery that is Semi Modular Synths. Pretty good fun messing about with all them, and there's been a really big resurgence in semi-modulars over the past few years. Got the Korg MS20 here. That's essentially a recreation of the 1970s MS20. It's 80% the size, but it's meant to sound exactly the same, although I expect if you're at a vintage owner you might find differences. But great Korg's unit, it's around €500 I think. And over here, I've got the Behringer Crave, which is very, very similar to the Moog Mother-32. They've got exactly the same inputs and outputs on the patch panels. They've both got one oscillator that's either a pulse or a sawtooth. They've both got a filter that can be high pass or low pass. They've both got a very simple envelope, and they've both got a simple sequencer as well. And then moving on to the center here, we've got the beautiful looking Moog GrandMother. Not to everyone's taste, but I really quite like it. And there are loads of them on the market at the minute, like the big sister of the grandmother, the Moog Matriarch. That's a little bit bigger than this. It's got a couple of extra functions, play 4 notes at the same time. There's things from Dreadbox, from Pittsburgh Modular, from Analog Solutions, and there's a real good reason for that. And that's because they're really good fun for experimenting with, but you don't have to be a modular synth expert to get started. They're nowhere near as daunting as a modular system. There's a basic signal path that's under the hood, so when you plug them in, you don't have to start using the CV connectors to get a sound out of them, but they are a dangerous gateway synth to a real synth addiction, and the only way out of that addiction is by buying another synth, then another synth, and then another synth, and perhaps even another synth and another synth. So let's start by taking a look at the basics. So they've got a pre-patched signal flow under the hood, which means we can take all these connectors out and still get a tone. So now we've got the basic setup of the synth. There's no extra modulation patched in, but the oscillator still goes through the filter and is controlled by the envelope. So let's put oscillator 1 on, play with the filter, mess around with the envelope. So it works exactly like you'd expect. Let's move over to something like the Crave now. Looks a bit different, looks a bit weird, but it's still the same thing essentially. So let's take all the modulation routines out, all these patch cables, and maybe plug in the output so we can actually hear what we're doing. So with nothing plugged in, we're still getting a sound. And all the knobs still do something. And that's exactly the same for the Mother-32, and it's the same for the MS20 and every other semi-modular, and that's what makes them semi-modular and not modular. They're already pre-patched to a standard signal flow. But there's no complex modulation happening here. If you saw my Pro 1 episode where I showed the modulation section on the left hand side where you could modulate oscillator A with oscillator B or use the filter envelope to modulate oscillator A, oscillator B, the pulse width and stuff like that, you can't do anything like that on these until you start patching. These are more flexible, you've got more patch points to patch into more things. So on this, for example, we've got, I think it's 14 outputs and 18 inputs, and that's exactly the same as on the Mother-32. And each of these patch points relates to a function of the synth. So it's quite obvious here that these 6 patch points relate to the functions in the oscillators, these 4 relate to the functions in the filter. It's not quite as obvious on the Crave or the Mother-32, but if you look at the labeling, you've got LFO triangle, LFO square, so that relates to this knob and this. The oscillator pulse and the oscillator sawtooth, you've got oscillator pulse, oscillator sawtooth. And if we move over to the Mother-32, it's a little bit more difficult to read, but it's exactly the same, with exactly the same inputs and outputs. But the MS20 is like hieroglyphics when you first look at it. Really quite confusing. I think even Lara Croft would have difficulty deciphering it. But let's take a look at creating a patch, shall we? Back to the Moog GrandMother then, and we know that the standard signal path has got the filter in it. We saw that earlier. But you see here we've also got a high pass filter, and that's not doing anything yet. It's not in the standard signal path. So to use that, we need to patch it in. So let's do that. We need a couple of cables. We need to take the output of the mixer, put it into the high pass filter, and then we need to take the output of that. Let's get a shorter lead, shall we? And put that into the input of the filter. So high pass will now go into the low pass. So which effectively gives us a bandpass filter, doesn't it? But really flexible one, because you can change the width of the band between the high pass and the low pass. Or you could have them in parallel as well, so you've got some of the sound going through the high pass, some through the low pass.
Yes, I really am talking about taking signals from the oscillators through the mixer and various attenuators and control modules in order for dual filter control. It really is magnificently interesting.
Let's try something a little bit more dramatic, shall we? Let's modulate oscillator 2 with oscillator 1. So let's take these out. Let's take the wave out of oscillator 1, and we're going to modulate the pitch of this. So what we want to do is take the wave out and we're going to put it through this thing called an attenuator, and that enables us to change the amount of modulation we're getting. So we'll take the output of that and put that into the pitch in. Put this on 0 for now. So if we turn on oscillator 2, and now let's turn up the modulation. Let's try a little sequence on that. So really more interesting tones we're getting there. It's sounding like a bit more like a much more complex synth, isn't it? Well, because it is now. I've got my cables at the ready, and I'm going to try and make a patch that creates a different cutoff frequency every time you hit the key. But then I'm going to have the LFO generating the trigger for the patch. So the LFO is going to be triggering it, and then I'm going to try and sync that up with the Crave. So this input here, which triggers the envelopes and the notes, will be controlled by the Crave. And because the Crave sequencer can be synced to a DAW, you can then sync that with external instruments, stuff that you couldn't do with the MS20 on its own. Let's get some white noise as the input for the random sound. Put that into the sample and hold. We want it to sample a noise every time we hit a key. So let's take the envelope generator out. Every time I press something, we're getting a different tone. And let's automate that so it's always playing. So we'll take the clock out and we'll put that into the trigger in. So there we go, we've got a constantly triggering note. Let's plug it back in again. That's a little bit uncontrolled, so we can control that with the mod wheel. Let's try that. So we take the mod wheel out, we put it into this VCA, we take the output from the sample and hold circuit, put that into the VCA as the input, and we take the output of that to the control input of the cutoff frequency. So now the amount of change of the filter is controlled by the modulation wheel. And let's bring in a second oscillator as well. So by some sort of miracle, that's all working. Let's try and control the speed of that then with the Crave. So I'll take the gate out from the Crave and I'll put it into this trigger in here. And I realise this looks full on completely geeky. I mean, that's not the most impressive of sounds you've heard. But once you start playing with these and you start tweaking and taking something out of here, plugging that in there, you start getting all sorts of interesting rhythms and interesting tones that you can't get from standard synths. And it's just fun. And what I've showed here is just the start, really. The possibilities, as I say, are endless. But do they outweigh the convenience of a standard synth? Well, you can't save the patches. Changing patches in a live situation is completely unfeasible, really. You can tweak stuff, but you can't go from one patch to another, which is why people end up with huge modular rigs and bits. One bit of it will do one sort of sound, another bit will do another sort of sound. And that's the problem with the semi-modular, is that it's sort of a gateway to the real addiction of modular synths. For example, I started my journey into the rabbit hole using the Moog Voyager and the CV unit you can get for that, and by patching that into my Moog Fogas, started to have a look at, start to realise that things can happen when you start patching one thing into another and everything's all synced together, some really nice stuff. So that now patches into my Analog Solutions fuse box, and I use the Moog GrandMother to plug into that as well, and now I've gone and bought myself a Euro rack box and I've started to buy a few modules as well, which I'll be looking at in the future. So it is a dangerous habit to start. But if you enjoyed that, don't forget you can catch it whenever you like on Clubbing TV's YouTube channel on our From the Studio playlist. And if you've got any questions, throw them in the comments and I'll see what I can do to answer them. And if you are thinking of picking up a semi-modular synth, check out my YouTube channel where I've got some really nice ideas for patches for the Behringer Crave that work as well on the Mother-32. There's loads of stuff to look at there, and they demonstrate how flexible these tiny little synths can be and what huge sounds you can get from them. So, I'll see you next time in the next episode of From the Studio.